In the quiet town of Maplewood, Emma finds herself at a crossroads after inheriting her late mother's boutique, a shop once brimming with warmth and purpose, but now on the brink of collapse. Struggling against the grief of her loss and the sharp criticism of her strict Aunt Patricia, Emma is determined to honor her mother's memory, even as her cousin Morgan's mocking words deepen her isolation. As Emma fights to rebuild the shop, mysterious notes begin to appear, urging her to keep going when her resolve wavers. Acts of kindness from unlikely allies, a loyal friend, a reluctant mentor, and even her once distant cousin help Emma rediscover her strength. Yet, the deeper she dives into her mother's legacy, the more she uncovers hidden tensions and secrets that could tear the fragile piece apart. With the boutique's success hanging in the balance, Emma must face her inner fears and mend broken relationships to revive not just her mother's dream, but the spirit of the community itself. Who is leaving the notes that push her forward? Can Emma find healing amidst the heartbreak and transform her pain into purpose? The biting wind howled around the corners of Patricia West's grand colonial house, shaking its shutters and rattling the tall windows. Inside, 10-year-old Emma Foster stood in the dimly lit basement, wrapping her thin arms around herself for warmth. The old concrete floor was cold beneath her bare feet, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered faintly. Her tiny cot sat against one wall, surrounded by crates of holiday decorations and unused furniture, making the room feel more like a storage closet than a bedroom. Emma shivered and adjusted the worn blanket on her cot, the edges fraying after years of use. Patricia, her aunt, had told her she should be grateful for a roof over her head, since Emma's mother, Annabelle, had passed away 6 months earlier. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like punishment. Annabelle's death had been sudden and left a gaping hole in Emma's heart. Once, her life had been filled with laughter, warmth, and the comforting hum of her mother's sewing machine. Now, her days were silent except for the stern commands of her Aunt Patricia and the mocking laughter of her cousin Morgan. That evening, as Patricia hosted a dinner party upstairs, Emma worked in the basement folding linens. She could hear the laughter and clinking glasses through the floorboards. The sounds made her heart ache. She remembered how her mother used to host simple gatherings, filling their small house with neighbors who shared stories and smiles. Her chores finished, Emma pulled out a small piece of paper and a stubby pencil she had hidden beneath her cot. Her hands trembled as she began to write a letter. "Dear Mom, I miss you so much. Aunt Patricia says I should not cry, but it is hard. Everything here is cold. Morgan is mean to me every day, and I wish I could come home. I miss your hugs. I miss your garden. It's so lonely without you. Please tell me what to do." She paused, wiping away a tear that smudged the paper. Then she folded the note carefully and crept up the basement stairs, clutching it tightly. She slipped out the back door and into the frosty night, her breath puffing in clouds as she hurried to the rusty old mailbox by the edge of the driveway. With a final glance toward the brightly lit windows of the house, she placed the letter inside and shut the lid. Returning to the basement, Emma curled up on her cot. She pulled the blanket tight around her and whispered, "Good night, Mom," before letting sleep take her. The next morning, Emma awoke to the muffled sounds of Patricia bustling around the kitchen. She quickly made her way upstairs to prepare breakfast for the family, as expected. Morgan, sitting at the table in her pristine school uniform, smirked as Emma placed a plate of toast and eggs before her. "Your hair looks like a bird's nest," Morgan said with a laugh. Emma clenched her fists, but said nothing. She was used to Morgan's jabs. After breakfast, Patricia handed Emma a long list of chores. "When you finish these," she said briskly, "you may go to the library for school assignments, but only if you are quick about it." "Yes, Aunt Patricia," Emma replied softly, tucking the list into her pocket. The hours dragged as Emma swept floors, scrubbed dishes, and polished furniture. By the time she was finished, her hands were raw, and her back ached. Still, she was determined to go to the library. It was the one place where she could escape for a little while. As she walked past the mailbox on her way out, something made her stop. The lid was slightly ajar. Curious, Emma lifted it and found a folded piece of paper. Her heart raced as she opened it. "Kind hearts still watch over you. Keep going." The note was simple, but Emma stared at it for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat. Someone had seen her letter. Someone cared enough to reply. It was a spark of hope in the cold gray of her world. At the library, Emma found herself lost in thought, the note tucked safely in her pocket. She didn't notice the older woman sitting nearby until she spoke. "You seem a little distracted, dear." Emma looked up to see Mrs. Caldwell, a neighbor she vaguely remembered from her mother's garden parties. The elderly woman smiled kindly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I was just thinking," Emma mumbled, unsure of how much to share. Mrs. Caldwell tilted her head. "I knew your mother, you know. Annabelle was a special woman, always thinking of others." The mention of her mother made Emma's chest tighten. "I miss her," she whispered. Mrs. Caldwell reached across the table and placed a hand over Emma's. "It's okay to miss her. She left a wonderful legacy in this town. Do you know about her garden?" Emma nodded. "She loved that garden. Aunt Patricia let it die." Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened. "Perhaps it doesn't have to stay that way." Later that evening, Emma returned to the mailbox and found herself thinking about Mrs. Caldwell's words. She hadn't been in her mother's garden since moving in with Patricia. It was overgrown and abandoned now, but the memories of planting flowers and picking herbs with Annabelle were still vivid in her mind. Summoning her courage, Emma slipped into the backyard and made her way to the forgotten patch of earth. The ground was hard with frost, and the plants were tangled with weeds, but she could still see traces of the beauty it once held. She knelt down and brushed away some of the dead leaves, revealing a small green shoot pushing through the dirt. For the first time in months, Emma smiled. "I'll make it beautiful again," she whispered to herself. As the week went on, Emma continued to visit the garden in secret. She cleared away the weeds and pruned the brittle branches, her hands red and raw from the cold. It was hard work, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, as she worked, Mrs. Caldwell appeared at the edge of the yard. She carried a small pot of snowdrops, their delicate white blooms defying the winter chill. "I thought these might be a good start," she said, handing them to Emma. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she took the pot. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Caldwell smiled. "Your mother's kindness lives on in you, Emma. Keep tending to this garden. It'll grow back, just like your hope." That night, Emma wrote another letter to her mother. "Dear Mom, I think I found a way to feel close to you again. Mrs. Caldwell brought me flowers for the garden. I'm trying to bring it back to life. It makes me feel like you're here with me. I hope you would be proud of me." She slipped the letter into the mailbox and returned to her cot, her heart a little lighter. Emma didn't know who had written the first note, but it had given her the strength to start healing. In the days to come, she would find more moments of kindness, more reasons to keep going. And slowly, the winter's shadow began to lift. The frosty morning air nipped at Emma's cheeks as she knelt in the garden, her hands buried in the cold soil. It had become her favorite place, a refuge from the constant demands of Aunt Patricia and the taunts of her cousin Morgan. The snowdrops Mrs. Caldwell had brought were thriving in the cleared patch, their small white blooms defying the icy weather. Emma had planted them carefully, whispering to them as if they carried her mother's spirit. She smoothed the soil around the base of another sprout and stood, brushing dirt from her knees. The morning sun glinted off the rusty mailbox near the driveway. It was time to check for a reply. Emma's heart raced as she approached the mailbox. She had slipped a new letter into it 2 nights before, pouring her gratitude and hope into the simple words she'd written. To her delight, Another folded note waited inside. You have your mother's strength. Keep tending to the seeds she planted in the garden and in your heart. Emma's hands trembled as she held the note. The words filled her with warmth, as if her mother were speaking to her directly. Whoever was leaving these messages understood her in a way no one else did. She tucked the note into her pocket and headed inside, feeling a little braver. The day began like all others. Breakfast was a hurried affair as Patricia barked orders for Emma to clear the dishes and prepare Morgan's school bag. "Make yourself useful," Patricia said as she sipped her coffee, her tone clipped. "Yes, Aunt Patricia," Emma murmured. Morgan smirked as she slung her bag over her shoulder. "Don't forget to scrub the bathroom floor today," she said sweetly, though her eyes gleamed with malice. Emma bit her tongue and nodded. There was no use arguing with Morgan. As the day wore on, Emma tackled her chores in silence, the note from the mailbox tucked safely in her pocket like a hidden treasure. When she finally finished, she slipped out of the house and made her way to school to work on her assignments. The library at school was a sanctuary of sorts, warm and quiet. Emma found a corner by the window and unpacked her notebook. She was so focused on her writing that she didn't notice someone approach until a tray was set down in front of her. "Hey," said a boy's voice. Emma looked up to see Sam Brooks, a classmate who rarely spoke to her. He was holding a sandwich, which he placed beside her notebook. "You didn't have lunch today," he said simply, shrugging as if it were no big deal. Emma blinked, her cheeks warming. Thank you," she stammered. "Don't mention it," Sam said, sliding into the chair across from her. "I know what it's like not to have much." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Emma nibbled at the sandwich, unsure of what to say. Sam didn't seem to expect anything from her, which was a relief. When the bell rang, signaling the end of study period, Sam stood and gave her a lopsided grin. "If you ever need help, just ask. You're tougher than you look." Emma watched him leave, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was the first time anyone her age had shown her kindness since her mother's death. That evening, Emma worked in the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was bitterly cold, but she didn't mind. The snowdrops seemed to glow in the fading light, a reminder that life could push through even the harshest conditions. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at the fence, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "You're making progress," she said, nodding toward the neat rows Emma had cleared. Emma straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I still have a lot to do," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "Gardens take time," Mrs. Caldwell said gently, "and so does healing. You're doing more than you realize." She held out a small trowel with a polished wooden handle. "This was your mother's. I found it in my shed last week. I think it belongs to you now." Emma took the trowel, her fingers brushing the worn wood. It felt like holding a piece of her mother's love. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Caldwell smiled warmly. "You're stronger than you think, Emma. Annabelle would be so proud." That night, Emma pulled out her stubby pencil and a fresh piece of paper. Her hands were steadier now as she wrote. "Dear Mom, today was a good day. Sam shared his lunch with me, and Mrs. Caldwell gave me your old trowel. The garden is starting to look better. It feels like I'm taking care of something that still belongs to you. I miss you so much, but I think you'd be happy with what I'm doing." She slipped the letter into the mailbox, her breath curling in the cold air. She looked up at the stars and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next morning, Emma found another note in the mailbox. "Your kindness is growing, just like the seeds you are planting. Keep believing in yourself." Emma tucked the note into her pocket and smiled to herself. She wasn't sure who was leaving the notes, but they were giving her strength. At school, she approached Sam during lunch and handed him a small paper bag. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Sam opened the bag to find a neatly sewn pouch. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Did you make this?" Emma nodded. "I used my mom's old sewing kit. I thought you could keep your pencils in it." Sam grinned and held it up. This is awesome. Thanks, Emma. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she had a friend. The garden continued to flourish under Emma's care. Mrs. Caldwell brought her more plants, and Sam helped her move heavy rocks to create a path. Even Morgan began to take notice, though her comments were still snide. "You're wasting your time," Morgan said one evening as she watched Emma from the back porch. Emma straightened and dusted off her hands. "It's not a waste," she said firmly. "This garden meant everything to my mom. I'm bringing it back for her." Morgan didn't reply, but she didn't mock Emma again that night. As the days turned into weeks, Emma began to notice a change in herself. She was still quiet, still cautious, but the weight on her chest didn't feel as heavy. The garden had become a place where she could breathe, where she could remember her mother without feeling overwhelmed by grief. The notes in the mailbox continued to appear, each one offering encouragement and reminding Emma of her strength. She still didn't know who was writing them, but they felt like a lifeline. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was growing just like the seeds in her mother's garden. The frost in Maplewood began to thaw, and the first hints of spring touched the air, but Emma Foster's world remained carefully balanced between hope and hardship. Her secret hours in her mother's garden had become her greatest source of comfort. The snowdrops and the small sprouts of green she had nurtured over the last month reminded her that change was possible, even in the harshest conditions. The notes in the mailbox had continued, arriving every few days like tiny rays of light. Each one carried a message that felt deeply personal, urging Emma to persevere. Her gratitude for the anonymous writer grew with each passing week, but life in Aunt Patricia's house remained unforgiving. Patricia's sharp words and Morgan's taunts were constants Emma had learned to endure. That morning was no exception. "You're filthy," Morgan sneered as Emma came in from the garden, her knees muddy and her hair windswept. "Better than sitting around doing nothing," Emma muttered under her breath, but she knew better than to say it loud enough for Morgan, or worse, Patricia to hear. "Emma!" Patricia's voice cut through the air, sharp as a knife. "You've left footprints on the floor. Clean them up immediately. Honestly, must you track your mess through my house?" "Yes, Aunt Patricia," Emma replied softly, fetching the mop without protest. Later that day, while tidying the attic, Emma found an old box of her mother's belongings. She knelt on the creaking wooden floor and opened it with care. Inside were photographs, letters, and a worn leather-bound journal. Her mother's handwriting, delicate but firm, was scrawled across the cover. "For my Emma, if you ever need to remember." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She opened the journal and read the first page. February 12th. "The boutique has always been more than a shop to me. It is a space where kindness blooms, where people come not just for clothes, but for help and hope. I wish Patricia could see that. She keeps asking me to sell it, but I cannot. This place is ours, Emma's and mine. A sanctuary." Emma blinked back tears. Her mother's boutique had been a cornerstone of their lives, a small, cozy shop filled with the hum of her sewing machine and shelves of carefully crafted dresses. It was where Annabelle had taught Emma about kindness, stitching small acts of generosity into the fabric of their days. Emma turned the pages and found more entries describing the growing tension between her mother and Patricia. One passage stood out. March 7th. "Patricia is relentless. She says I am selfish for keeping the shop, that it is holding the family back from progress. But selling it to her would destroy everything I've built, everything I've promised to Emma. I cannot give in." The words lit a spark in Emma's chest. Her mother's quiet defiance, her determination to protect the boutique, reminded Emma of the strength she herself was learning to find. Emma shared her discovery with Mrs. Caldwell that evening as they tended to the garden together. "She fought for it," Emma said, clutching the journal. "Even when things got hard, she didn't give up." Mrs. Caldwell placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Your mother was one of the strongest women I've ever known. She had a way of seeing the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That strength is in you, too." Emma smiled, her resolve hardening. "I'm going to make her proud." The next day, Emma found herself drawn to the old boutique, which Patricia had left vacant since Annabelle's death. The windows were dusty, and the once bright sign now hung crookedly. Emma peered inside and imagined her mother at the sewing table, humming softly as she worked. "You miss her too, don't you?" a voice said behind her. Emma turned to see Sam standing there, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Yeah," Emma said quietly. Sam tilted his head toward the boutique. "My mom used to say your mom helped everyone who needed it. She fixed our curtains for free once when we couldn't afford new ones." Emma's eyes widened. "She never told me that." Sam shrugged. "She didn't like to brag. She just wanted to help." The words warmed Emma, but they also deepened her longing. She knew she couldn't let her mother's legacy fade. That evening, Emma wrote a letter to her mother. "Dear Mom, I found your journal today. I didn't know how hard you fought to keep the boutique, to keep everything you built for us. I want to make it beautiful again, like it used to be. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. I promise." She slipped the letter into the mailbox, her heart aching with determination. The following morning, Emma found an unexpected visitor in the garden. Mr. Blake, the retired mailman, was leaning on the fence, his cap pulled low against the chill. "Good morning, Emma," he said, tipping his cap. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," Emma replied, surprised. "I heard you've been keeping this garden alive," he said, gesturing to the neat rows and blooming snowdrops. "Your mom would be proud." Emma's heart swelled at the praise. "Thank you," she said softly. Mr. Blake leaned closer. "Your mother and I were friends, you know. She used to leave letters in the mail for people who needed a little extra encouragement. She believed in the power of words." Emma's eyes widened. "She wrote letters for people?" He nodded. "Not many knew, but those letters made a difference. Maybe you've got a bit of that in you, too." Emma thought of the notes she had been finding in the mailbox. Could it be Mr. Blake? She wanted to ask, but hesitated, unsure if she wanted the mystery solved. Over the next week, Emma threw herself into revitalizing the garden and planning how to restore the boutique. Sam offered to help her clean out the old shop, and Mrs. Caldwell donated some spare fabrics to get her started. One day, as Emma sorted through a box of scraps, Morgan appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" Morgan asked, her voice skeptical. "Fixing it," Emma said simply. Morgan crossed her arms. "Why? No one cares about this dusty old shop." Emma stood tall, meeting Morgan's gaze. Mom cared, and other people did too. This place mattered to her, and it still matters to me. Morgan frowned, but she didn't argue. Instead, she left without another word. Emma began sewing small projects using the fabric Mrs. Caldwell had given her. Her stitches were uneven at first, but she remembered her mother's patient hands guiding her years ago. Slowly, she improved, creating simple but beautiful things, quilts, scarves, and pouches. She gave her first finished piece, a soft scarf, to Sam. "Wow," he said, running his fingers over the fabric. "This is really nice." Emma smiled. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." "It's better than perfect," Sam said. "It's real." As the garden flourished and the boutique began to show signs of life, whispers spread through Maplewood. People started remembering Annabelle and the kindness she had shared. Some left small donations of fabric or tools at the shop, inspired by Emma's efforts. One evening, as Emma sat in the garden, she found another note in the mailbox. "Your mother's spirit lives on in you. Keep planting seeds of kindness. They will bloom." Emma tucked the note into her pocket, her heart full of determination. She didn't know who was leaving the notes, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. Spring arrived in Maplewood with a burst of color. Crocuses and daffodils lined the sidewalks, and the once-abandoned garden in Aunt Patricia's yard flourished under Emma's care. The snowdrops were now surrounded by vibrant blooms, their colors a testament to Emma's determination to bring life back to something that had once seemed lost. The boutique, too, was beginning to reflect Emma's hard work and the kindness of those around her. Though it was far from the bustling haven it had been in her mother's time, the windows were clean and the interior had a fresh coat of paint. On a small table in the corner, Emma displayed her handmade scarves and pouches. She had no customers yet, but she felt the shop's heartbeat slowly returning. Still, life with Aunt Patricia remained cold. Patricia dismissed Emma's efforts, calling the boutique a waste of time. "You should focus on real responsibilities," Patricia said one morning over breakfast. "That old shop isn't going to put food on the table." "It's not about that," Emma replied quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about keeping Mom's memory alive." "Memories don't pay the bills," Patricia snapped, her tone cutting. Morgan, as usual, smirked at Emma from across the table, but for once, Emma didn't let it get to her. She had started to find strength in herself, a quiet resilience her mother's notes and her friends' support had helped her build. Later that day, Emma returned to the boutique. The scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air as she set to work sewing a new batch of scarves. Sam arrived not long after, carrying a basket of tools. "I figured we could fix the shelves today," he said, setting the basket down with a grin. Emma smiled. "That would be great. Thanks, Sam." The two worked side by side for hours, chatting as they hammered and painted. For the first time in years, Emma felt a sense of companionship that she had missed deeply since her mother's death. "Do you think people will come?" Emma asked, glancing at the empty display racks. "They'll come," Sam said confidently. "You just have to give it time. Things that matter take time." His words echoed Mrs. Caldwell's advice about the garden, and Emma nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. A few days later, Emma stood in the garden, marveling at how much it had changed. The weeds were gone, the flowers were thriving, and even the neglected shrubs had begun to bloom. She carried a small bouquet of daffodils and snowdrops to the fence where Mrs. Caldwell was pruning her roses. "For you," Emma said, holding out the bouquet. Mrs. Caldwell smiled, her eyes softening. "Thank you, dear. These are beautiful." "They're beautiful because you helped," Emma said earnestly. Mrs. Caldwell reached out and took Emma's hand. "You're the one who made this happen, Emma. You've brought your mother's love back to life." Emma's throat tightened, but she managed to smile. "I just wanted to make her proud." "You already have," Mrs. Caldwell said. That evening, Emma found another note in the mailbox. "Your kindness is inspiring others. Keep going. You're creating something beautiful." Emma tucked the note into her pocket, her heart swelling. Whoever was writing these notes seemed to know exactly what she needed to hear. The next morning, Emma woke to an unusual sight. Patricia was standing by the garden, her arms crossed, a strange expression on her face. "What are you doing out here?" Emma asked cautiously. Patricia gestured toward the flowers. "I didn't realize you'd done all this." Emma hesitated, unsure if her aunt's tone was critical or curious. "I just wanted to bring it back," she said. "It's what Mom would have wanted." Patricia's gaze softened, just for a moment, before she turned away. "Make sure you finish your chores before you head to that shop of yours," she said over her shoulder as she walked back inside. Emma sighed, unsure what to make of the moment, but she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe her aunt wasn't completely unreachable. That afternoon, Emma found a surprise waiting for her at the boutique. On the small table where she displayed her scarves and pouches, someone had left an envelope. Inside was a crisp $20 bill and a note. "Your work brings joy." "Thank you." Emma's eyes widened. She held the note close, her heart racing. Someone had bought one of her items. Someone believed in her. The support Emma received from the town grew in small but meaningful ways. Mrs. Caldwell spread the word about the boutique, and Sam brought more tools to help Emma improve the space. Even some of Morgan's classmates stopped by to admire Emma's creations, though Morgan herself remained aloof. One day, Morgan wandered into the shop while Emma was arranging her latest batch of scarves. "You really think this will work?" Morgan asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Emma straightened and looked at her cousin. "I think it already is." Morgan stared at the neatly arranged display, and then at Emma, her expression unreadable. Without another word, she turned and left. As the boutique grew livelier, so did the garden. Emma often found herself humming as she worked among the flowers, feeling closer to her mother with every bloom. One evening, as she planted a new row of daisies, Sam appeared at the gate, holding a box of seedlings. "Thought these might add some color," he said with a grin. Emma beamed. "Thanks, Sam." The two planted the seedlings together, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. That night, Emma wrote another letter to her mother. "Dear Mom, the boutique is starting to feel alive again. People are noticing it, and they're helping. I think they remember how much you cared about this town. I'm trying to be like you, kind, patient, and strong. I hope I'm making you proud." She placed the letter in the mailbox, her heart full of gratitude. The next morning, Emma found a new note waiting for her. "You are making her proud, Emma. Keep planting seeds of kindness, they're growing everywhere." As Emma read the words, she felt tears sting her eyes. The notes, the garden, the boutique, all of it was proof that her mother's legacy was still alive. And for the first time in a long while, Emma truly believed in the future. The boutique's front bell jingled softly as Emma adjusted a scarf on the display rack. The shop was no longer silent and still. Its walls hummed with new life, just as her mother's sewing machine once had. While customers remained scarce, Emma had begun to notice small, meaningful changes. More people stopped by, even if just to chat or admire her handiwork. She looked around with pride. The fresh paint and repaired shelves gave the space a welcoming warmth, and the table of her creations near the window caught the sunlight beautifully. The scent of lavender from a small vase by the register lingered in the air, a reminder of her mother's touch. "Emma?" Sam's voice broke her thoughts as he walked in, balancing a stack of folded quilts. "Mrs. Caldwell said these might sell better here than in her garage sale." Emma smiled and took the quilts from him. "She's amazing. You both are. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Hey," Sam said, giving her a lopsided grin. "You're the one doing all the hard work. We're just cheering you on." Emma blushed but didn't argue. Sam had been her rock in recent months, helping her carry her mother's dream forward in ways she hadn't thought possible. The following weekend, Emma decided to hold a small open house at the boutique. Mrs. Caldwell had suggested it, insisting that it was time the people of Maplewood saw what Emma had been working on. "You need to show them the heart of this place," Mrs. Caldwell had said, squeezing Emma's shoulder. Emma spent hours preparing, arranging her scarves, pouches, and other handmade items with care. Sam hung string lights around the windows, while Mrs. Caldwell brought cookies and tea to serve to visitors. Even Morgan contributed, albeit begrudgingly, by helping Emma polish the counters. "I'm only doing this because Mom said I had to," Morgan grumbled as she wiped the glass with a rag. "Thanks, Morgan," Emma said simply. Morgan paused and glanced at Emma. "You're weird," she said, before returning to her task. As the open house began, a few neighbors trickled in, drawn by curiosity. Emma greeted them with nervous smiles, unsure of what to expect. She was tidying a corner display when she overheard two women near the door. "Annabelle would be so proud," one of them said softly. "Her daughter's got her touch," the other replied. "This place feels like her." Emma's chest tightened and she blinked back tears. Her mother's spirit was still here, woven into the walls of the boutique and the hearts of those who remembered her. The day grew busier than Emma could have imagined. People from all over Maplewood stopped by, some buying her creations, others simply offering words of encouragement. "I remember when your mom made my wedding dress," said Mrs. Harrison, a regular from her mother's time. She touched one of the scarves reverently. "She put so much love into everything she did. And now, so do you." Emma thanked her, feeling the weight of her mother's legacy settle over her like a comforting blanket. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma stepped outside to catch her breath. The garden, now brimming with vibrant flowers, greeted her with its peaceful beauty. She had added a bench beneath the old oak tree, and it had become her favorite spot to think. Sam joined her, handing her a steaming mug of tea. "You did great today," he said, sitting beside her. "Thanks to you and everyone else," Emma said. Sam nudged her shoulder lightly. "Give yourself some credit, Emma. You're the reason this place is alive again." Emma sipped her tea, letting the warmth seep through her. "It feels like she's still here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She is," Sam said, "through you." Later that night, after everyone had left, Emma found another note in the mailbox. "The seeds you've planted are blooming, Emma. Your kindness and perseverance are changing everything." This time, she felt ready to confront the mystery. She went to Mrs. Caldwell's house and knocked on the door. When the older woman answered, Emma held up the note. "Is it you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you the one writing these?" Mrs. Caldwell smiled softly, but shook her head. "I wish I could take credit, dear, but it's not me. Whoever it is, they know you well." Emma's heart sank a little, but Mrs. Caldwell placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Does it matter who's writing them?" she asked gently. "What matters is what they've given you the strength to keep going." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. "You're right." The next morning, Emma awoke to a quiet house. Patricia and Morgan had gone to visit relatives for the day, leaving Emma alone. She decided to spend the time working in the garden, trimming back overgrown vines and planting new seeds. She was deep in her work when she heard the creak of the gate. She looked up to see Mr. Blake, the retired mailman, walking toward her. "Morning, Emma," he said, tipping his cap. "Good morning," Emma replied, brushing dirt from her hands. Mr. Blake hesitated for a moment, then handed her a folded piece of paper. "This is for you." Emma unfolded the paper, her heart pounding. "You've made her proud, Emma. Keep believing in yourself." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mr. Blake. "It's you, isn't it? You've been writing the notes." Mr. Blake nodded slowly, his face kind. "Your mother and I were friends. She used to write letters for people who needed hope. After she passed, I thought you might need some too." Emma's throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't need much, Emma," he said, his voice steady. "You had the strength all along. You just needed a little reminder." The days that followed were filled with new energy. The boutique welcomed more visitors, and the garden flourished under Emma's care. Patricia, though still stern, had started to soften in small ways, offering less criticism and more quiet observation. Even Morgan seemed less hostile, her teasing less sharp, and her presence less distant. Emma's world had begun to change, not because of grand gestures or dramatic moments, but because of small acts of kindness that built upon each other like stitches in a quilt. One evening, as Emma sat on the garden bench with her journal, she wrote her final letter to her mother. "Dear Mom, I finally know what you meant about planting seeds of kindness. The garden is blooming, the boutique is alive again, and people are remembering the love you gave this town. I miss you every day, but I know you're still here in the flowers, in the shop, in me. Thank you for teaching me to be strong, to be kind, and to never give up." Emma folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. This time, she didn't leave it in the mailbox. Instead, she held it close to her heart, knowing her mother had already received every word. A year after the boutique reopened, Maplewood felt like a town transformed. What had once been a quiet, tired place now thrived with renewed life and purpose. The small shop that Emma had lovingly restored had become a symbol of the town's heart, a place not just to buy handmade goods, but to feel connected, welcomed, and inspired. The boutique's shelves were full now, not just with Emma's creations, but with items made by others in the community. Mrs. Caldwell's knitting, Sam's woodworking, and even some of Morgan's hesitant first attempts at embroidery sat among the scarves and quilts Emma had perfected over months of practice. The garden behind Aunt Patricia's house had grown wild with beauty, spilling over with colors and life. Daisies swayed in the breeze, roses climbed trellises, and the snowdrops, always the first to bloom, remained Emma's favorite. Neighbors often stopped by to admire the flowers or offer a kind word, and Emma always greeted them with a smile. One warm afternoon, Emma sat on the garden bench, a basket of sewing supplies at her feet. Roger, the ever-faithful golden retriever she had convinced Patricia to let her adopt from the shelter, lay beside her, wagging his tail lazily. As she stitched the edge of a new quilt, Emma looked up to see Aunt Patricia standing near the gate, watching her. "Would you like to come sit?" Emma asked gently. Patricia hesitated but eventually made her way to the bench. She sat stiffly at first, her hands clasped in her lap, but the warmth of the garden seemed to soften her edges. "This place," Patricia began, her voice quieter than usual, "it reminds me of your mother. She loved this garden." Emma nodded. "She did, and the shop too. She always said they were more than just places, they were her way of giving back." Patricia looked at her niece, something unspoken passing between them. "I didn't understand that before," she admitted, "but I think I do now." Emma smiled, her heart light. "It's never too late to plant seeds, Aunt Patricia. Mom always said kindness grows wherever you nurture it." In the months that followed, Patricia began to change. She wasn't perfect. Her sharp words still slipped out occasionally, but she started helping Emma in small ways. She brought fresh lemonade to the boutique on hot days, and even donated a few antiques she had stored in the attic to use as display pieces. Morgan, too, found her way into the rhythm of the boutique. Her embroidery skills improved, and she often stayed late after school to help Emma tidy up or brainstorm new ideas for the shop. Though her teasing never entirely disappeared, it softened, becoming more playful than mean. 1 year to the day after the boutique's reopening, Emma hosted a celebration. The shop overflowed with visitors, neighbors, friends, and even a few new customers who had heard about the store from outside Maplewood. A small table near the entrance displayed a photograph of Annabelle, smiling brightly, alongside her old sewing scissors and a few pages from her journal. Emma stood by the photo, greeting guests as they arrived. Mrs. Caldwell gave her a warm hug. Sam presented her with a wooden sign for the shop that read, "Annabelle's Haven," and even Aunt Patricia clapped her on the shoulder with an approving nod. As the crowd milled about, Emma stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The garden was aglow in the golden evening light, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Roger trotted over and rested his head on her lap, his eyes full of calm. Emma pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was her final letter to her mother, one she had carried with her but never left in the mailbox. "Dear Mom, your garden is blooming. The shop is alive. I think you'd be proud of what we've built here. I couldn't have done it alone. Your kindness lives on in so many people. I still miss you every day, but I see you everywhere. In the flowers, in the fabric, in the people who come to the shop, and in the small acts of kindness that keep growing. Thank you for teaching me to plant seeds, to have faith in tomorrow, and to believe in love." Emma placed the letter in the soil beneath the snowdrops and patted the earth gently. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. As she stood, Sam appeared at the gate. "They're asking for a speech," he said, grinning. Emma laughed, brushing dirt from her hands. "All right, let's not keep them waiting." She returned to the boutique, where the guests had gathered near the register. Clearing her throat, Emma smiled at the faces around her. "This place was my mother's dream," she began. "She believed in kindness, in community, and in the power of small acts to change the world. Today, we celebrate her legacy, but we also celebrate all of you because each of you has helped make this dream a reality. Thank you for believing in me and in the seeds of kindness we're planting together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emma's heart swelled. For the first time in years, she felt complete. That night, as Emma locked the boutique and walked home, the stars above Maplewood seemed brighter than ever. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every tear, and every moment of doubt. The seeds she had planted both in the garden and in the hearts of those around her were blooming. And as Emma looked toward the future, she knew her mother's legacy would continue to grow, one act of kindness at a time. If Emma's story touched your heart, please subscribe to support more inspiring stories like this. Share this tale with your loved ones to remind them that even small acts of kindness can plant seeds of hope that bloom for generations. Let us know in the comments what Emma's journey meant to you, and thank you for being a part of this story.